post show. What is it? What is it not? Now, this period, I would say largely the goal, the priority is to restore and to regulate those dysregulations that occur from being in that state of low energy availability. Now, this period, it can last for 6 weeks. It can last for 6 months. I mean, like, there isn't a strict guideline for how long like your post show actually lasts before you transition into a true like intentional growth phase or maintenance phase, health phase, whatever you want to call it. But this is essentially how we're going to establish a baseline for what the preceding phase is going to be. Now, let's take someone who is highly resilient, someone who didn't take any extremes during their contest prep. Even then, even if you are very resilient, even if you did everything by the book, I can speak to this. Like, I mean, anecdotally, my last prep, I did everything very systematically. There were no unnecessary extremes that were really taken. Drug use, very minimal. Yet, my post show, it was messy. It wasn't smooth sailing. And I think like getting into why it's hard. Why is this period so challenging? It's because of the alteration in the physiological demands on the body relative to that individual's baseline prior to contest prep. So you take someone who, maybe they're used to sitting generally very lean. They're used to sitting at a lower body fat, yet to do so, it's not very taxing. To do so, it doesn't require a lot of strain, whether that be literally, like, okay, it requires a lot of changes in their execution and their scheduling and modifications to how they approach creating the deficit or, whatever, adhering to their workouts. Yet once they enter contest prep, that changes. That's one aspect. Okay, the physical demands of being in prep and the adjustment in order to meet those demands versus intrinsically those stressors and the weight that carries for that individual and then the duration that they have to sustain that. So it really comes down to there being an insufficient amount of energy for the individual in order to drive down body fat and in order to become a stage lean. And how this input, or I guess lack of input, this output is then captured by the body. The physiological cascade that then occurs, these alterations, I mean, that ultimately is what I'm referring to when I'm talking about dietary fatigue. Sure, there's a component to that is, exclusively mental fatigue and just like your ability to consistently adhere. I had a client this morning who in his check-in, he was like, to be honest, I'm feeling burnt out. Like, this is hard. It's hard to sustain what I'm doing. And it's not necessarily that we're in a steep deficit. It's just that not a contest prep client, but he's like, this is challenging given the changes in circumstance, in career path and personal struggles. He travels a lot for work. And he's like, I do feel like I'm at the point of burnout, despite maybe previous deficits that have been objectively greater. They have been more challenging. And like, this is very similar, and this can be applied to both men and women, but it's essentially the chronic state of being in a state of low energy availability and the effects relative energy deficiency syndrome that in men can cause some degree of hypogonadism, in females hypothalamic amenorrhea. And this is something that, again, the impacts highly individualized, like how this actually translates in terms of symptoms, how this presents. For some, they've experienced this their entire life. That is their baseline. They're like, I've never been in a non-amenorrheic state. But the solution, it's going to be very similar. And it essentially boils down to removing any kind of stimulus that is driving up fatigue, any kind of stressor. This can come from training volume. It can come from actual like structured cardio. Cardio is very fatiguing. You guys know. So like reducing both of these, reducing the volume or the frequency down to at least like a maintenance, which can be scary, especially if you're someone who's like, I've never not done cardio or I've never not trained 5-6 days a week. Inversely, raising the calories up. Sure, that can help. But relative to post-show, we have to be mindful of this because in this state, hunger signaling is going to be heavily skewed, which is something I'm going to get into here shortly. But as we're increasing calories into, let's say, a surplus, into a state or at a level where the individual is not experiencing compounding dietary fatigue, there is going to be some degree of fat gain that occurs depending on the client's the actual surplus, like the degree of the surplus we're in. Because when you break this down, to lose 1 pound of body fat per week, that means you need to be in a 500 calorie deficit per day. Okay, well, in order to gain a pound of body fat, which is not what we want in this state, or for the most part, I'm going to say any state, we're not just typically aiming for body fat gain. If that's what we're going for, if that's like what we're at least calibrating our radar to, like, okay, what would need to happen in order to put on a pound of exclusive just body fat, it doesn't require that much, especially when you consider that, like, in a state where you're not reporting food as tightly, you're not tracking intake, there are a bunch of hidden calories, like kind of slipping through the cracks. Maybe a few days you miss some cardio, maybe activity's a little bit lower because, you're lax now because, oh, hey, I'm going to go shopping instead of doing cardio. That's going to, work out to the same calorie burn. Sure. Whenever you're making these, micro adjustments periodically throughout the day, it's actually very easy to overshoot, put yourself in a position where, now you are 500, or maybe not even 500, you're 300 calories over. Okay, well, even let's scale that back. Okay, let's say you're 250 calories over. In 2 weeks, 250 calories over your maintenance. 2 weeks, that's going to result in a pound of body fat gained. This is the part that I think becomes convoluted, because these two camps really do push, like, okay, I want you to continue to practice a hyper restrictive, very rigid approach to post-show, which ultimately is going to continue to drive up dietary fatigue. It's going to also set the precedence that, like, if you are not 100% on track, there's going to be weight gain. Even if technically we're not, getting ready for a show, we still have to have some degree of rigidity in place, which, yes, splitting hairs, I do believe in that globally. I believe in structure in how you're going to modulate your calorie intake, if that's something that, like, if composition is something that you want to have control over. If you do, if you don't want to get fatter and you have a higher appetite and just generally hunger signaling is not something you're, like, super attuned to, then maybe that degree of rigidity is needed. And your perception of how rigid you actually have to be in order to prevent yourself from gaining body fat, largely going to come from hunger signaling, as well as your body fat set point and how far away from that body fat set point you actually are. And this is why, like, letting hunger dictate intake post-show, I think that's a very slippery slope that a lot of people, they kind of buy into the fantasy of, well, you're not getting ready for something immediately. There's not something down the pipeline 3 months from now that is going to require you to be in the best shape, or let's just say best very loosely. It's obviously subjective, but there's not going to be something a few months down the road that requires you to be at your lowest body fat level. So what's the harm in being a little loose, a little off track here and there? There's nothing wrong with that, except the fact that being in that state for so long, being dieted down, being at a low body fat, and potentially being at your lowest body fat thus far, the consequences, yes, physiologically of, like, accruing fatigue from the prep itself, that's there. But then there are the physiological adaptations relative to hunger signaling that are unavoidable. And frankly, that is your body signaling, okay, I need more fuel to survive, to do the functions that are required on a daily basis. What you're feeding me, the input, the calories, the energy that I'm receiving is not enough to accomplish what needs to happen. Just because you finished your season and like, hey, I'm not going to be on stage and, like, food's going to come up, body fat's going to come up, your body didn't get the memo. Like, it doesn't receive that in a way. I do kind of humanize it. It doesn't trust that you're going to do that. It's going off of all of the proof, all of the evidence that you've given it thus far. And for a lot of people, that's like 3 to 4 months of being in a hypercaloric restricted state.